I'm making go YouTube live now.
All right. And hope that was a long enough wait. Hello, and welcome to the monthly program for BayChi. And for those of you for whom this might be a first time here, BayChi is the local chapter for the special interest group Computer-Human Interaction, which is a subgroup of the international organization ACM, Association for Computing Machinery. So our mission is, so we are a volunteer-led organization dedicated to raising awareness around human-computer interaction. And we hold these meetings as a monthly open to the public thing, virtually since the pandemic started, but every month on the second Tuesday. So you're all welcome to join us as a member of the public or as a member of BayChi itself. So BayChi, we do have a membership that you can join. I believe it's $20 a year. It helps support our activities in collecting or recruiting our speakers and paying the various fees involved in Zoom memberships and so on. But as volunteers, you are, as members, you are also welcome to volunteer. We have plenty of, here's a whole bunch of information about our website. You can see more there. These are some of the activities and things that we offer as an organization, including this thing is the second Tuesday of each month. On the fourth Tuesday of each month, I host a separate sort of discussion meeting about it's really just social networking. How are you doing in your career? Do you have things that are bothering you or on your mind every day as a UX person? An opportunity to just check in with other folks, and mostly around the Bay Area, to whom you don't have to define what an affordance is. So let's see. So we've got a third Tuesday thing that's brewing. That will be a discussion about UX tools. And I think next week may be its first meeting, but you can check on the baychi.org site to get more details about that. Moving on, and being a volunteer-led organization, we are comprised of volunteers. So if you feel an interest in getting involved, we have plenty of ways for you to do that. Just send us an email at volunteer@baychi.org, and we'll be happy to find you a place that you're interested in contributing. One of the sort of fairly high profile things that we need help with is a treasurer right there on the top left of that list. And yes, so if you're number minded, that is a blinking, a bright blinking highlight of a way to contribute. So we have a set of program chairs who recruit and schedule our speakers each month, and they taking turns between the months and so on. This month we have our program chair Smitha, who will be introducing today's speaker.
Thanks, Edwin. Hi, everybody. I'm Smitha, actually co-chair, along with Nancy, who wasn't able to join us today, as well as Ted. And today we have a former BayChi program co-chair for over 5 years, at least 5 years, Christian, and who invites us to talk about Superfriends, the relationship between product management and user experience design functions. Hopefully it's a topic that's close to many of us. And a little bit about Christian. Currently, he's a product and UX leadership consultant at Design and Product, where he also hosts a product and UX community. He was recently appointed by the governor of California to the state's Office of.
Thanks. And I will also go to a full. Got it. Slideshow. So once again, people should be seeing my main screen. Is that right?
Yep.
Great. Okay. Well, let's get with it. So it's funny. There's a little history on. If you saw the original announcement that went out, we somehow lost the S off of this, and it got announced as Superfriend, which maybe loses some of the spirit of the two-sided relationship of product management and UX. But there's a strange history to this, because when I gave this talk in Zurich, for somehow it was listed as Superfriends, the power of the product management and user experience. And somehow maybe translating it into German or Swiss German or something that's lost in translation. But we're talking about the relationship between product management and UX. And for a quick little sort of overview of what I'm hoping to cover in our time, and thanks everybody for coming out on school night to hear about this. First of all, just talking a little bit about why are we talking about products in software these days? What does product mean? What's a product? What's product design, or what are product designers? How do these concepts relate, and how are they supposed to work together? A little bit of like honest talk about some pain points and frustrations that I'm hearing about, that I see in my consulting, that I hear when I give talks or here in my community. You know, sharp elbows and stepped on toes in the relationship between UX and product in a lot of environments. And then a little bit of more positive, like, well, what can we do about it? A little, you know, kind of a optimistic look at things, and talk about empowering ourselves rather than feeling like victims, or like, oh, we got so close to a seat at the table and now there's this product bro and it's sitting in the seat instead. What happened? And maybe, you know, my reputation doesn't always fully precede me. I mean, you heard my bio, but I come from a UX background. I've had a lot of UX roles at large companies and startups. I've been an IA, an interaction designer, a content strategist, design manager, UX director, product director. And so eventually I shifted over to product titles, but I think I always kind of kept my UX chops in the mix, I hope. So we're talking about product a lot these days. It seems like more and more recently. It can be a little bit confusing, especially when so many things that they call products online are also very clearly services. Even they're services more than products in the old-fashioned sense. My sense is that once we had SaaS, you know, once we had software as a service online, the line got really blurred. And when we talk about products and services, we're often not talking about different things at all, although we're sometimes still talking about different lenses, you know, where the service journey is often more holistic and cutting across complex systems, whereas product thinking is still sometimes very much focused on a specific release or endpoint or something like that. And again, what do we mean by product? When I grew up in the previous millennium, if you asked me what a product was, I would have said it's some kind of a thing like this, something with that's packaged with a familiar branding on it. You go to the store and it's on the shelf, and there's a whole bunch of them in a row, and the price is sort of consistent and reliable, and the quality is, you know, sort of expected. And maybe you grew up with it in the house and you keep buying it when you're an adult. And that's sort of my mental model of a product, you know, kind of pre-internet, I guess. But we're talking about digital products these days, and it's not always clearly defined what we mean by that. So it can be sort of annoying to some folks because it smuggles in some concepts that aren't fully elaborated on or clarified or defended. So this is also a product nowadays, right? And I just took a screenshot from Amazon, you know, where there's the opportunity to subscribe to detergent that will be sent to you at some cadence that's close, hopefully, to like how often you're going to run out. And, you know, you can see that familiar Bugs Bunny, you know, like Tide spiral there, and a version of the logo that still exists. But now we're talking about, you know, Tide Pods, not a box of powder. And we're talking about a subscription. You're signing up to be charged regularly for this, and it solves a problem for you, which is going to the store and buying it over and over again. So that's also a product. Now that's a product too, and you can see that it shares some some characteristics with the other products. There's still laundry detergent going on here. But the relationship with the provider and the nature of the product also has to do with this scheduled buying in this case, and also buying it online, and it's packaged differently and it's fulfilled differently. But still, a lot of the old DNA of what makes something a product is hanging around here. This is a somewhat famous and controversial diagram made popular by Martin Erickson, one of the founders of the Mind the Product conference. And anytime I show it, I sort of feel like I have to make some caveats because it can be potentially reductive and misleading. It puts things in circles and equates them that are very vastly different things with that mean different things to different people. It also asserts that the product manager is the role that's in the middle of everything. And I like to say that probably every discipline could write a Venn diagram that put them in the middle or put us in the middle and put everybody else out in the wings. So I sort of say, be cautious about this. But on the other hand, it's not a bad shorthand for the different realms of making software that product managers touch on. So they certainly need to be familiar with UX and work with UX people. They need to be conversant with technology and work with engineers. And they both represent to a lot of people the business side, but also they need to coordinate with a lot of people in the business outside of the product team and bring those points of view to bear as well. So you can see sort of from their point of view why they feel like they are in the center of a storm here of these different points of view. That diagram is so used and distributed online that it spawned 1,000 memes and variations. And as a person who's become a product manager myself, I'm allowed to I have license to make fun of us. So I don't think it's true that they're really hated by everybody, but you can see that's a trend. Now, this is a slide I stole from Peter Merholtz, well-known UX pioneer from Adaptive Path, who wrote a book on org design for design orgs, very good book. And he likes to rewrite that diagram I just showed and said it's mislabeled. That corner that's being called UX is really design, and UX is another name for what happens in the center when you merge design and tech and business. And the design, because the experience of a digital product is the product itself. And I think he makes a real good point there. And the point is really about a shared concern of the people with the UX lens and the people with the product lens. It doesn't necessarily account for the fact that people with UX design titles or UX strategy or research titles and people with product management titles are not doing the exact same job as each other. They're doing different things. The truth gets, the convergence between these ideas gets a little bit more true at the organizational level or the leadership level, where you can start to say, again, these are lenses. UX and product are lenses on things that involve design and involve business and tech, but are different ways of packaging up some learnings like UX, users, human-centered design primarily, and a number of other disciplines that have sort of been merged into UX, like industrial design in general, and information architecture and things like that. HCI, of course, and the product side, which draws more from a sort of a different train of thought. I mean, they both derive from marketing in some ways, but the product school of thought, comes more from a business perspective originally, and then sort of this like lean startup version of product that we see today. So even though we're talking about the same thing, like what's the experience for the end customer, product now has started to become a shorthand for human-centered design, but also agility and and check, having data and using it to sort of verify whether you're on track and being willing to iterate and change your plan as you go, and being very outcome focused. Another person has remixed that old popular diagram to try to say, look, you're not there in the middle of all those things. The whole team is working together to make the product. And the product manager is actually mediating between the product that's being built and what customers want. And you can question whether this is a great visualization of that, but I like this idea that people are sort of commenting on the old diagram and trying to sort of make another statement about it. When I was giving a talk over at MasterCard, they shared with me their current version of how they talk about the guilds that they have, and what they think those areas are responsible for. And one thing you might notice is that they have moved product out of that center. Product is now more of the synonym for business in their model and responsible for what they call viability and what I would sometimes call value. And then what they call consumer experience and design is responsible for desirability in their term, and engineering is determining feasibility. That all these things are somewhat reductive, but they're helpful models sometimes to get these conversations going. In some ways, outside of these Venn diagrams, I prefer this model from Geoff Redfern, who's he might be the chief product officer now, but he's certainly at least a senior VP of product at Atlassian. And he used to be a VP of product at LinkedIn. When he was there, he launched the mobile version of the LinkedIn app. So he's got some successes under his belt. And at Atlassian, he has really championed product craft. There's an internal, a global Atlassian product conference internally once a year where they bring all the product people together and train them and have them hang out and level up and everything like that. So he's put some good thought into this stuff. And so he has this triangle, which if you at first glance, it may seem like just another version of that Venn diagram. You might say, okay, the general manager type is a boss, it's business. The artist, well, that's the designer, and the scientist, I guess that's the engineer. But if we're going to think more about what these concepts mean, you'll realize those aren't the same. That's like saying cyan is the same as blue or something like that. An artist is not a designer, as I think we all know. An artist can make whatever they want. They're visionaries. They are expressive. They use intuition. They invent things. They see the future. They detect patterns and things, stuff like that. Designers, have to meet constraints. They use artistic skills to deliver value. And so designers are in here somewhere, but that artist archetype is a different thing. And similarly, a scientist and an engineer are famously not the same thing either. Scientists on some level are interested in theory. They run experiments. They use data. They're informed by data. And they're willing to question their hypotheses. Now, a lot of these things are true for engineers as well, but in engineering, by definition, engineering is practical and focused on delivery. So, which in this case, the general manager is adding that practicality. But what's interesting is to say that if a person's interested in product management, you could think of yourself as probably coming most strongly from one of those corners, maybe to some extent being a person who lives on the line between one of those two corners, somewhere in between them. But the great product manager is sort of in the middle of the triangle somewhere, partaking of all three of those different temperaments and modes of doing. But nobody starts out there. We start off in a corner. We start off along one of the sides. If you want to grow as a product manager, then what you need to sometimes acquire is experience and aptitude and insight and mentoring, et cetera, towards the corners where you don't naturally sort of ground yourself, so that you can get maybe not to dead center in this triangle, but somewhere into like a smaller triangle, where you'll still probably start. If you were an artist to begin with, you'll probably always be a little bit on the artist end of the spectrum of these things. But anyway, I think that's an interesting way to think about these, what goes into making a good product manager or product person. So we could talk a little bit more about what do product people do? What do we mean when we say product person? What do I mean when I say that? So I like to think of it, and this might help. It could help or hurt. I think some people like this and some people don't, although it's kind of true right now. And it's a little confusing that there's a concept of product management and there's a concept of product. And sometimes product is just used as a kind of a hip shorthand for product management. I'm a product manager, I do product. I'm a product person, I'm a product guy in my case, but I don't like to say guy because it sounds exclusive. I don't think it has to be a guy. But we're also saying it's a product team. There's a head of product, UX rolls up to product. So then you're like, well, wait, is product management one of my peer disciplines? Or is product the overarching thing we all do? And product management is just one part of it. And if so, why do they both have the same name? Or is that privileging the product manager in some way semantically? I think that sort of has to be worked out team by team. But I think it's useful for me, from my point of view, it seems useful to think of it as product's a paradigm. It now means making a kind of software that is kind of packaged and being delivered typically as a service. And it's a frame we didn't used to have when we were just making websites and before mobile apps came along and before a lot of these approaches to sort of packaging and selling software online didn't really exist. So the product paradigm wasn't really around or quite as strong 10 or 20 years ago. But it's kind of become the dominant way of looking at things. And like I said, it's sort of become a packaging for a bunch of related ideas, human-centered design, or obsessive customer focus or something like that, as well as agile iteration and learning, and rather than being locked into a 6-year program, project management death march with a Gantt chart, experimentation, agility, and focus on outcomes rather than on sort of features and things like that. So if you're a product team, yes, in some ways the product manager is responsible for holding the team's feet to the fire in a lot of those areas. But you can also say that everybody on the team is a product person. The UX researchers or the user researchers are product researchers. The designers are product designers. The developers are product developers. And sure, the people doing the sort of orchestration are called product managers. I think the term manager is problematic in some ways because they're not people managers, and it again gives this impression of authority, sort of in the way that architect, when information architect was a term that came along, some technical architects on the engineering side found that kind of offensive, that a junior entry-level person could be called an architect when this was a very high-ranking title on the engineering tree. So, there's some semantic hooks issues with these names. But the gist of it is that you think of it, we're all working on these things that we call software products now. And so the researcher's not researching malaria on another continent, and the designer's not designing shoes or rocket ships, and the developer is not, making a submarine, and the product managers are not sort of running some sort of like building a detergent box. We're making digital software, and so we're doing this in a shared collaborative way, and we all have different specialties. But the strategy doesn't belong just to the product manager. It should be something the whole team is having a say in. And I will say that I'm talking often about how I think this stuff should work, and I want to acknowledge that that's not always true. It's often not true. And a lot of people might say, well, that's not been my experience. My product manager isn't collaborative, or they just told us one day we were a product team and they didn't tell us what that meant, or they changed my title from UX designer to product designer without any explanation. And so there's a lot of, variance out there. But I think a pragmatic way to think about this and to make use of it as a concept is to say, okay, product is this lens, it's popular, it speaks to business, and it brings in a lot of these things we care about, like design, like user experience design. Yes, it also brings in this lean, agile stuff that's been a challenge for a while, but we've got to figure out how to make that work anyway. Speaking of which, you've got this lean startup cycle, build, measure, learn. It's pretty much become article of faith among most product people, at least as an ideal. Not all teams can actually do it. I think there's critiques of how this actually gets played out. Like there's not always real learning going on. There's just optimizing around data points. Or even the idea that if you start with build, then you're putting something in the field before you learned anything. It's a weird place to start the cycle. But cycles are cycles. In some ways, it kind of doesn't matter where you start. And even a lean startup that just quickly built a prototype and tested it on some people, the truth is the founder had some idea and talked to some folks, and there's some sort of lightweight form of research actually probably did happen. So there is a risk that this very tight cycle of just experimenting and learning doesn't really have learning in the sense that we think of it if you're trained in user experience design or research. And there's some tension there in when do you de-risk complicated stuff and do desk research or field research, and when is it okay to throw something out there and let the users vote on it directly. Another thing that product people have to do, and the product manager often has to play a big role in this, is working with the engineers, getting the engineering counterparts on the same page, sort of leveraging their insight and their wisdom and their knowledge of the stack, but also sometimes understanding when they're being risk averse or when they're being overly optimistic, and including them but not overwhelming them with irrelevant detail. It's a whole art to collaborating with engineers and product people, and they are product engineers, so they're also product people. But the product managers, as I said, are often having to corral folks. If you work in software, if you work on the UX side or the design side, then you certainly work with engineers too. You don't get anything built unless an engineer builds it for you. Unless you're the jack of all trades, you can do it all. But on some level, I think a lot of designers might be a little frustrated when what ships is not exactly what they designed, but they don't feel like it's their fault. They're like, well, the Figma was perfect. It's not my fault that the front-end engineer didn't, get it pixel perfect. I tried to do the design QA and they didn't think it was important, so I washed my hands of this. On some level, the product manager doesn't get to do that, even though they're not able to fix everything themselves, they sort of have to eat it if it doesn't come out right. So it's an interesting relationship, similar to the UX relationship with engineers, but one where you're a little bit more on the hook for what happens. Product people also have to coordinate the work of multidisciplinary teams and often complex stakeholders, collections of stakeholders. Have to make sure that people are kept in the loop and that there's communication. Have to persuade people who don't report directly to you to go along with the plan or to be to cooperative or collaborative, and need to sort of learn how to use diplomacy. Product managers, again, do a lot of that. Often I think UX designers are people in the mix doing that as well, coordinating across different points of view. And I'd say that they're being product people in that same way when they're shouldering, that burden of bringing together all these different forces towards a unique solution that can really address the needs and be successful. So then there's this concept, I think I've touched on it a little bit, of product designers. The job title showed up a while back, or maybe it's always been around, but in tech it was a thing. It's sort of been, it's meant different things at different times in different companies from what I can tell. For instance, it feels like to me about 10 or 15 years ago, Facebook was hiring people they called product designers, and they kind of meant that to be like a unicorn, a person who could do some research in the morning and whip up a prototype in the around lunchtime, and in the afternoon, do some pixel perfect design, and then like over dinner time maybe like ship the front end code. And there's people out there who can do that, but that kind of paradigm, it's great for a tiny little startup or for a company that has its pick. But most of us aren't so great at every single aspect of design. And I don't think it means that to a lot of folks anymore. Sometimes it means a synonym for UX design, and it's just like a better, this is the newer voguish title. We're just calling all our UX designers product designers. Sometimes it means that the designer does have more responsibility for some of that product strategy or product management or product thinking. I think that regardless of how it's being used, like if the term's being used in your organization, or if you are a designer and you say, well, I need to position myself in products, so I need to think of myself as a product designer, then there's a whole bunch of kind of like attributes that UX brings to the table and that the design background sort of has to offer as assets in this larger product paradigm that's in some ways coming from outside. Starting with all the methods of discovery, user experience research, and other kind of forms of discovery. The fact that design inherently is a method of solving problems. It's like this was in some ways the fad of design thinking, was to communicate that design itself is a toolkit for that leverages creative methods to solve problems, to invent solutions to problems. And so UX training brings that to the table. Using understanding the users and synthesizing all the different signals and coming up with a persona or a model or some sort of description of the people that you're trying to build for. Also, not just being hung up always in data-driven this and data-driven that, as if data could drive the car. I think data can tell you whether you're driving well or not, whether you're straight, whether you're going to make it on time. But often the data tells you what is going on, but there's work to be done to figure out what's causing that to happen. What's the reason? There's a hypothesis, but we have to find out if it's true. And sometimes you can do some tests, and sometimes you have to go out in the field and talk to people or observe them. A lot of UX roles, the strategy roles, interaction design, IA, UX roles, architecture roles involve systems thinking, sort of being able to build a picture of a whole complex system or a complex model, put a lot of things into context. Similarly, put things into information architectures, or figure out, how all the content elements relate to each other and how they're going to be managed. All those kinds of things are helpful. Those are all things that the product manager needs to get done and sort of needs to understand to do their job well. But unless they come from a UX background themselves, they may not have a full toolkit to model and picture and describe and capture the essential details and elements of what the team is making. So that's something UX can often bring as a gift. Like, hey, we made a map, we made a picture, we made a stack diagram, and everybody can now look at it and go, I agree, or I disagree, or let's go to level 3 on this chart now, or something like that. Product and UX people clash sometimes around this, but also can definitely collaborate on prioritizing, methods, kind of like the old, you'll find one thing where product managers and UX people do overlap is in like the use of stickies and the kind of collaborative workshops and stuff like that. So there's an ability to ally on that if you can figure out a way to do that. And then, I guess just it's almost like the basic craft skills of like the ability to help put a picture together, visualize something, find the right words, tell the story. Product managers need to do that all the time. They need to influence executives, stakeholders. They need to update everybody what's going on. They have to convince the press of something or get people to buy something. And if you can help articulate, the story or the picture or the diagram that connects the dots for people, all those things are assets that are needed in the product paradigm, but that UX people bring, a lot of strength to the table in addressing those things. So I think I've mentioned already and kind of touched on the fact that it's not always a very happy relationship right now. People sometimes feel like, do I have to become a product manager to get back into strategy? Or why is this person telling me my ideas? There's no time to do research, or we can't get that on the roadmap. Product people have their own frustrations too. I talk to both sides, and when there's miscommunication and unmet assumptions and unspoken problems, what you'll find is often both sides are unhappy, but they tell very, very different stories about what's going on. For instance, I recently hosted a conversation for a Mind the Product event in London. I wasn't in London, but it was remote, where I had a chance to talk to product managers and ask them about their view of the relationship with UX people. And one of the things we asked them was what were their stereotypes of UX folks. And some of them were very loving. They're like, I would never do a project without my UX designer, or they're great partners. We love them. They're excellent. But other people said they slow us down, or they're kind of arrogant. They think they're better than us or whatever. And you might say, well, that's not fair. That's a stereotype, or I've never met it. UX people are nice, but it's interesting to hear from the other side that like, oh, we might be coming off. Some of us might be giving a bad impression, just like some of those product managers are giving a bad impression to people over here on the UX side of the fence. So for instance, a lot of people who are not the product manager feel like the product manager has a grip on product direction and roadmap and prioritization, and that things are coming downstream again. Like UX has fought, design has fought to get upstream, to get to the table, to be involved in strategy. And then suddenly it's like, why is a product manager handing me a wireframe and telling me to color it in? How did that happen? Requirements similarly are sometimes just handed down rather than figured out together. So you feel like you're going backwards. Like we went through user stories and jobs to be done, and personas or whatever, user journeys, and now suddenly we're getting a list of requirements to design. How did that happen? At the same time, design and research folks are sometimes speaking your own language, our own language that product people are not fully initiated into. And it can be sort of alienating jargon, and you can lose the plot. Often when user research is being presented to product managers, there's a lot of detail about process, often these really, really thick decks. And it seems like it's trying to justify everything, but it's actually overwhelming the product manager with detail and making it hard for them to pick on the critical points. The way that things get prioritized is often like not is done in a way where, again, it's just handed down or found out, and people feel like they're being left out of that. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of talk about fully empowered product teams, or Marty Kagan's idea of an inspired team, or teams that can sort of be fully independent. And in reality, we find that's not what's happening. Often a lot of product teams are performing agile rituals and having retros and doing all these different activities, and at the same time still acting like a feature factory and cranking stuff out and taking tickets from the bosses and not really being outcome focused or anything like that. So when you hear that, you hear one thing and then you see your own lived reality and they don't match up. That can become very discouraging. Deep down, like I said, I think I've already mentioned this, that there's some assumptions that aren't being met. The product managers think design and research have a certain role or purpose. They don't fully understand the history of all of this and the value of it, and they might assign a certain purpose to it that isn't the same as what design and research feel like is their value and purpose, and vice versa. the UX folks are not always fully clear on what the product managers are supposed to be doing, what their goals are, what success looks like to them, what their dangerous situations are, what they're afraid of. And so instead we have these kinds of assumptions. So that person's a jerk, or they don't get the user, or they don't care, they're just about money or something like that. And it's often more nuanced than that. But because of these unexamined assumptions, because they haven't been brought to the surface, because the awkward conversations haven't happened, you just keep bumping into each other in the dark, and it's very frustrating. And then even when you have leadership supposedly say you all should get along, if the work hasn't been done to get to alignment, then you just have this constant nagging frustration with working with each other, which is going to come out in the software in some ways. If the team is not getting along, it'll show in the results. So, okay, that's kind of that are some of the unhappy. That's probably not even an exhaustive list, and people could probably suggest other things that they haven't liked at times on the way their multidisciplinary teams have worked together. But what this brings me back to is this idea that there is no one recipe for this. There's no simple model everybody can apply. We're unique people. We're in changing times. Technology is evolving. Methods are evolving, and the terminology is changing. People bring past experience to their new teams, but not always in a conscious way. And teams don't always charter themselves or define this is how we work, or this is our method. Sometimes they just sort of carry on with assumptions. And it can seem frustrating. Like, can we just get down to work? Do we have to spend time talking about how we're going to work all the time? Like, it can feel like living in a group house and having endless house meetings all the time about who left the peanut butter jar out. But the reality is that we do have to spend time negotiating how to work together and learning how to work together, because it isn't figured out yet. And all this friction is costing us something. But if you kind of go through the difficulty and face up to it, there's a huge opportunity there. So one thing is, you get these issues about turf, like who's in charge of what, or who's setting the schedule, or at what point are you included? And these are creative problems. These are problems that require creative problem solving, collaborative creative problem solving. Everybody avoids them because you don't want to be told no, or you're afraid it's going to be a difficult conversation. You kind of know the other person doesn't agree with you, or else they would already be including you at the right level. So it's natural to want to put that off, or maybe ask your boss to fix it for you, or just be frustrated. But at some level, there's always this need to one-on-one negotiate with your collaborators and go, hey, I'm not sure we all agree on my role and your role. Can we talk about it? And, we can say, look, there's things we're both involved in, but we have to be clear on who has the final say, who signs off on the design, who signs off on the feature prioritization, things like that. And why don't we just actually tell each other what we think it is right now, and not be too afraid that maybe we don't agree, because we probably don't, that. And I've done things with my consulting clients where we generate a lot of stickies with tasks on them. The team needs to do all these things. Just first of all, just neutrally, just adding them to the board. And then you ask people to sort them out. Who does it? The UX, someone on the UX team does this thing. One of the product managers does this thing. And, generally speaking, you'll get 2/3, 3/4 of them will sort out okay. Like, most people are, not trying to do the same job all the time. But you get these contentious things in the middle where two hands are on the sticky, or two dots on the sticky, or whatever. And those are the things, first of all, you've made progress right there. If you said, okay, we've isolated the problem topics, and some are fine, let's go back to business on who does this and who does that. But user research, we're disagreeing on product discovery versus user research. So let's focus on the tricky ones. But let's say, okay, how do we think it works? Let's get a whiteboard out and go, first you do this, then I do this, and what happens after that? If you can't agree, you just agree that there's some gray areas. Like, okay, we've got some stuck points. We're not going to agree in one discussion. These are the tricky ones. We have to figure this out. If you feel like the person you're negotiating with is just being unreasonable, they're like basically not willing to give you the basics of what you need to do your job well, that's when you go to your boss and say, I've tried to work it out, but they're not including me in the research, and I can't do UX if I'm not included in the research, or, whatever that sticking point is. If I'm a boss and someone on my team says, I'm having trouble working with Joe and this other team, my first question is, have you tried to work it out? And if they haven't, I'm going to ask them to try to work it out. If they say, yes, I have, but I still can't do it, and I can't coach them through that, then I know I need to go talk to Joe's boss and go, what's the plan here? Because it's not working at the level of our team members. But the main thing is just to come up with some working agreement. Like you're not going to sort it all out in one day, but you can say, okay, we agree on 2/3 of it. There's 1/3 of things we're not sure about. Let's agree for now on some temporary, flip a coin on these things, or divvy them up for now, and we'll revisit this in the next sprint. If the other person's very aggressive, let them have all of the contentious things, but as long as they agree to revisit it afterward, and then be honest, do the iterative thing of having retros and finding out whether things are working the way they're supposed to. Like I said, I've done this with a number of teams. I've never seen the same list of tasks, and I've never seen them get sorted exactly the same way. Because again, every team is different, and they bring people with different backgrounds and skills, different ideas about what these terms mean. Certain patterns are common. I mean, some things never get put over on the UX side, and some things never get put over on the product side. The stuff that shows up in the middle, though, I've seen a lot of variety. I do think that there's a huge opportunity around this, like what product managers call customer obsession, and what UX people call user research. But this idea of like deeply understanding the frustration points and needs of the people you're building your software for, and learning about them. Right now, this is a problem because in a lot of shops, because product managers don't fully understand how user research works, or find it to be sometimes too cumbersome, and go off and do their own half-baked research that user experience people find to be not really valid. And it can be difficult getting on the same page, but it's worth trying to do that and finding compromise. Like even if your product manager just wants to send out a survey, and that surveys are problematic, or that not the right sort of mode for the kind of research you need to do here, maybe you pick your battles and say, fine, let me help them write better survey questions. Let me add some of my research issues to some of my research goals to the agenda here. And vice versa. If you've got your own research plan going on, maybe invite them to help you set some goals, or try to let them ride along, or let them add some questions to what you're going to be asking, and things like that. There's also, like I said, if you can visualize things, if you can make pictures or diagrams, or show a map of how to get to where you're supposed to go, and contribute that to the product manager, then in some ways, rather than asking to be included in the strategy or the conceptual work, you're just immediately demonstrating that you bring something to the table there, and that it's to the benefit of the product manager or the product leadership to be including you in this, because what they get from that is a clear map, or a direction, or an artifact that's useful. As I said, if you've got information architecture background, if you've got that ability to synthesize complex systems, and to sort of visualize complex sort of contexts, then again, that's an asset that you can bring to the table. As a former IA, practicing IA once and for all, always in IA, but who hasn't had the title in a long time, I cherish these kinds of diagrams, and I make them for myself when I need them, because I start to lose track of too many dimensions of stuff. But I'm not as good at it as I used to be, and I'd rather ask my UX designer to make the diagram for me or with me. And I want to partner on that. Even though now I have the product manager title, I know the value of these kinds of things that help crystallize. And sometimes it's a loose sketch on a whiteboard, like, hey, are we talking about this or that, a circle or a triangle? And other times it's something like this that you make it, in Figma or whatever nowadays, and so everybody can agree about it or discuss it. I've mentioned already, so I won't belabor the point, that user experience often, practices, research practices, and other sorts of, methods like that, help bridge the gap between just a purely data-driven approach where you just look at numbers and assume you know what they mean, and then try experiments to move them, to one where you come up with hypotheses about what you think is the issue. Like, the data is telling us what's actually happening. Let's go out in the field and find out if why we think it's happening jives. Did traffic go up because everybody loves the new feature, or because we're getting closer to a holiday? Let's see what other people did. Let's see what the data, what the other evidence shows out there. Let's see what our customers are telling us. Then over time, you can run experiments and try to test your hypotheses. And user experience folks have not always been deeply involved in this kind of experimentation, or often growth-oriented or data-driven approach to trying to tweak and improve things. It can seem alien to a more user-centered, design-oriented approach. But I think that to do good experiments, you have to design ideas. You have to design what you're going to test. You have to design the actual interface or variation or concept or promise that you want to see how people respond to. So there's a huge role for UX in that as well. And I think, as I've touched on already, there's a whole set of traditions of prioritizing, of putting up a whiteboard and putting up an axis of like effort versus impact or importance versus urgency or other kind of criteria, and helping to facilitate a room full of people to agree on what to do next, or what's the best idea to try, or what to spend time on. UX people do this, product people do this. You might as well do it together and leverage those skills. Let's see. So I think if you're in a position where you're in leadership or you have a say in this kind of thing, maybe if you are the product person, for instance, it's important not to say, well, these people, we don't need the engineers yet, so we'll tell them later what the plan is, or the design's done, so we don't need to invite the designer to the meetings anymore. I mean, clearly, some people are more heavily involved in some stages than others, but we are multidisciplinary teams, bringing together a lot of different perspectives and backgrounds to make this complex new kind of software that we make. And generally, you need the brain power of everybody, strategically and all the way through. And sure, the designer is doing design QA and just being included and tweaking and fixing stuff at the end, and not doing as much work when they're sort of figuring out all the details of the design. And the engineers might be working a lot harder closer to launch than in the early stages when things are being conceptualized. But sort of the pistons, go up and down, but the team is fully involved the whole time, ideally. If you're a UX person, I think most people who come to Beikai have a UX background, but we're in the midst of Silicon Valley, and certainly we get product people as well. So we can talk to each separately for a moment. I like to say that, think of the UX toolkit that you've developed in your profession as a set of superpowers that you have, that usually you're shining them on the end user, like deeply understanding that end user, learning their language, figuring out why they don't like the processes they have today, healing those processes, coming up with like new experiences and service flows that they can, try that actually work better than what they do today. And then, and talking to them, studying them, fixing things, changing things, learning from their behavior. What if we use that same toolkit on coworkers that we have trouble collaborating with? What if we thought about their language, their needs, their frustration points, why the flow isn't so great for them? We know why it's not great for us. And we can, we certainly care about our own feelings and try to make things better for ourselves. I'm not saying we should always, take on the whole burden of fixing every problem. But if you are a UX person and you think about how your customers or your end users, we already challenge ourselves to meet them way more than halfway. I think it's a part of the UX ethos that we don't expect the customer to come to us and learn our lingo and the gap themselves. We're trying to meet our customers where they are today. So if you thought of that product manager who somehow the relationship with them isn't ideal, as having a workflow problem with you that you could try to solve in the same way you would try to solve someone's problem signing up or getting through an experience that you had designed, there's a lot of opportunities there to apply your skills and your problem solving methods, to making that relationship work better. And I could flip that script too and say, if you're the product manager and you've got frustrations with your UX counterparts, or you're not quite sure exactly how they're supposed to fit in, or you find something about their attitude annoying, imagine that they're one of your customers, and who isn't buying something. Is it their fault they're not buying what you're selling, and that they're not performing what you want, and being retained as much as you want them to be? Instead, you would try to deeply understand that customer and what they need and what they're looking for and what their job is to be done, and why the ways they do things today don't work so well for them. And, so I think that there's a model of taking the same exact toolkit that you use to solve problems for the people out there who pay our bills, and applying them to the sort of workflow challenges and the relationship challenges in-house. And it's kind of it's sort of a relief when you realize, oh wait, yeah, I know how to solve problems like this. I've got methods for that. This is definitely solvable stuff. And if you take on some of the extra burden of trying to be the one to make it work, you have more agency rather than feeling like, well, this problem isn't going to be fixed until they change or until my boss, steps in and knocks some heads together. So that's pretty much my point. There's no one answer. We all wish that we could just like read one book or one Medium post and it's like, this is the right org chart. These are the right titles. Here's the job roles and here's how you make software. But it's this constantly shifting environment. It's therefore the job of each team to actually work out their own methods and sort of negotiate their own relationships and their own approach. You do have to draw lines and be clear about responsibility, but they shouldn't be like silo lines where people don't cross, but clear lines about who has sort of decision points. You have to have working agreements, like they used to say. I guess that one of this was it Agile or Scrum that had the idea of rough consensus and running code. You just need a working consensus to get through the next sprint, and you can always reevaluate your working arrangement. But you don't have to be fighting all the time. You say, for now, we agree that it's this. And even if, I can disagree and commit to this approach and then raise it again next time. And I think with all those things, there's a huge opportunity. Product and UX sit very close to each other on the table. That's actually potentially two voices in the strategy rooms, in the rooms of leadership, talking about the customer or the user, talking about the fact that your product won't be any good if it doesn't meet real people's needs, talking about the things that we care about, the things that brought most of us into UX in the first place. So instead of kind of being like siblings in the backseat of a car kicking each other, could actually be like a united front. So I just want to kind of as an epilogue say that I do host a community called Design and Product that is for people interested in this kind of spectrum between UX and product management and the relationship, and maybe even thinking about being in one role or the other. So if you're interested, you can come to my website and there's a little form. It's just mostly to make sure you're not a bot, and I will let anybody in who's interested. You may know that I've got this book out with Rosenfeld Media, Product Management for UX People. And if you don't know, you do know. And you also may not know that there's a conference coming up, a remote conference on December 6th with Rosenfeld, my publisher, also called Design in Product by coincidence. Sort of expands on a lot of the themes of my book and also the talk that you heard today. We've got a really great program that we're putting together. Some of the speakers you can see there already. I also teach a track at something called Ambition and Power, which is like a continuing education, professional education program for mid-career and senior UX people. There's a lot of different, there's a number of people teaching different topics there, designing with AI, leadership, ethics, a number of different very cool topics. I do a product management topic there. One of these days, I started writing this book, Growing Product People, and didn't finish it. There was a pandemic, other stuff happened. I've just been talking to somebody who might co-write it with me and finish it, so that could come out too. And that's about it. We'll share the slides, the link to the slides. I think we can put them in the chat now if we haven't already. And I believe that this QR code will also work if you want to just like, aim your phone at this or whatever while we got it up on the screen. But that was what I had for you today. Thank you for listening.
Awesome. Yes, we will definitely post the links in the program, but also I can paste the link in the chat. Does anybody have any questions or comments or thoughts? More than welcome to unmute yourself and start the conversation.
I guess I can start with the first question. Thank you, Christian, for this great presentation. My question is looking at the whole thing as maybe more as a, what can we do as a proactive approach, meaning going all the way back to design education. So what would you suggest, what kind of courses should be included in four-year design curriculum that could prepare a designer? I don't want to refer it as UX design. I want to refer it as design.
Mm-hmm.
They would prepare somebody getting out to the workforce with the skills that needs to be actually part of their tool set.
Yeah, that's a brutal question because I don't know if I have a happy answer for it. I think um, education struggles to keep up. You know, the methods that educational institutions typically use to develop curricula and perfect them, um, kind of like often move on the cycle of years, and so that they're playing catch up. I mean, I did, for instance, now I have a younger friend who I knew when she was in college, and she was taking UX classes at Columbia. This would be about 5 or 6 years ago. Of course, there were no UX classes in college when I was in college. UX wasn't really a thing yet. There may have been some vague human computer interface.
Well, it wasn't called UX, it was called, I mean, the
Yeah.
definition of UX is very fuzzy.
Right. So there were human factors. There were other things that existed,
Mm-hmm.
precursors. But the idea that you could take a UX class literally it was new to me. And she interviewed me for like a project she did to learn a little bit about like the history of UX and things like that. And by the time she graduated, she had decided she'd actually want to be a product manager. So she'd sort of already moved through that, something that took me 10 or 15 years of my career. She'd sort of decided to go that direction before even entering the workforce. So, I'm not quite sure. I think I'm not an expert on education at all. And I think that, and I've often heard that the education that people get does not prepare them for the workforce. So when they get to the workforce, it's all a big surprise. Again, I heard this about architecture students when I was in college hundreds of years ago, that they would learn architecture, but then they get in the real world and they knew nothing about how to make a real building, and they'd learn on the job, how you really do architecture, or what the architect's real role is in the making of most buildings. So there might be a sense in which you just have to learn the rudiments and then get into the field and catch up with the latest stuff there. There might also be a need for sort of something like continuous education, or the idea that you when you start off, you're kind of an apprentice, but that you need a curriculum that's ongoing throughout your, I think your whole career, but certainly the early stages where you're kind of building your pillars of your practice over time.
So this is in a way similar to how doctors in medicine are being trained. You study and then you practice for a couple of years.
I guess in the sense, particularly because of that idea that there's no way what you study in school will be current. It will not. Some of it won't be true anymore. And if you don't read the journals or keep up somehow, you'll fall out of step.
All right. Thank you.
Sure. Interesting question.
There was one question, I believe, from Meg around seeing the slide, and I think that's the slide that you're on.
Yeah, I think I tried to
which
see that one. If that's what they want to see.
Yeah. Is this the one? Actually, is Meg still online?
Yeah, I was just hoping we could
Okay.
walk through a little bit of that slide, and I was when it flashed, I was very interested, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about it.
Sure. I mean, I grabbed it literally as just sort of an illustration, so I'm not necessarily the deepest expert on the Forrester analysis that this comes from. But I think part of the point is that often metrics, particularly product manager growth, especially kind of growth hacker style product management metrics, are often very heavily focused on user growth, revenue growth, retention, monthly active users, daily active users, certain churn, these aggressive empirical evidence that you are getting users or they are paying or not. And those metrics are important. They steer the ship and you need them. But that's a hyper focus on like what's happening inside your product live when your product's being used, and to some extent the habitual behavior of your customers. Whereas things like some of these customer experience metrics are ways of looking at the larger journey, looking at their perceptions or their behaviors outside of your product, how they talk about it to other people, would they recommend it? Are they satisfied? Would they be sad if it went away? So I think this is, I think this is just a useful analysis of some of the other things that you can measure and how they are measuring the experience in a way that's not quite as literal as, like, say, the conversion rate on something you're selling. I don't know if that's enough elaboration, but beyond that, I'd probably just be making it up.
Thank you. That's helpful. And yeah, it's good to know. If I want to learn more, I could go look it up on Forrester, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think it is good to break out of, like, often I mean, I was talking to someone recently looking for advice, and they were looking at some very conventional metrics, and after a little bit of conversation, they realized, oh, they could look at things like reduced complaints from the call center. They could look at, you know, like there's other indicators out there of quality or the kind of behaviors you're hoping for that aren't always just like, did people click on the button or not?
I
I
have a
know. Yeah, go ahead, Janet.
Sorry,
I was
I
just about to
don't know
call
if there's another direct question. I've been sort of sitting here trying to formulate what is my question. I'm worried it's more of an observation, which is really painful when people do that. But I have, you know, a long career as well because I'm old. And my career started in product development, actually, in the days when it was called product development and not innovation. And we did a lot of product development for a lot of sort of CPG, blue chip companies, that sort of thing. And then I moved to a company called Nestle, and I was what was called a product manager. And then I became a brand manager, which was different from a product manager. And then I became an innovation manager that tapped into both the brand managers and the product managers. And so, but it felt like the roles were siloed, but interdependent on each other. But there was a sort of clarity about who was responsible for what, and you evolved through these. And it really helped by the time, you know, you worked alongside designers and the research team and market research and, you know, research and development people in the factories. And you had this sort of like, it was a really eclectic time where you gathered all these sort of associations and skills by association with all these other functions. And I've been trying to get my head around why it feels so much clearer to me when I think of it in the product space. And then the last 15 years, I've been working in the digital space. I'm now in the Bay Area and, you know, work for a lot of digital companies. And why it feels so fuzzy the whole time when it's in the digital space about who's responsible for what. I don't know if you have and actually in the research world, I mean, I come from a market research background. I'm a qualitative researcher now. I do a lot of UX research and market research and marketing research and CX research. And I don't have any problem with that because I've always done it all. But then I come across people who are like in their little pod and, you know, feel like they can't transfer their skills. So it's just an interesting time as to why it's become.
No, it's a very interesting question. And I think, and I'm not an expert on sort of industrial design and industrial products, but I think that I think you're sort of pointing to, on one level, a higher level of stability in the practice and in the methods, maybe a longer stretch of time where essentially like the 20th century, where scientific business methods were put in place, and maybe there was some more general agreement on what an account manager does, or what a product manager does, or what an innovation manager, like there may have been a time for a community of practice in the industry with conferences, with various sort of ways to align on that, and certification and training and everything. Whereas I think things churn a lot faster in internet technology. It's sort of more malleable, more fungible. It changes a lot faster. So there's a lot more reinvention. And in some ways, as you've noticed with the lingo, like everything's old, that's old is new again. Like when we have product managers now, but they're not this, it doesn't map one-to-one, right? But it does inherit some DNA, and the terminology is invoked for a reason. Like the progressives in 1920 were different from the progressives today, but people use terms because they're trying to say we want some of that, or we want to think about it like an industrial process. We want to be more strict and organized about it. But there is also another aspect about stability or something, which I have thought about a little bit, which is like my Tide box. You know, if you make a product like that, like a Procter and Gamble product in like 1945 through 95 or something like that, or today even, you know, every single one coming off the line is pretty much the same with some tolerance. And you've literally you've got a factory that's tooled to make that product. It's actually, you know, when that piece breaks, you go to a person who knows how to make that piece for that line to ship consistent physical product to a certain degree. And that's industrial scale product delivery of physical objects. And so that that forces a stability where things don't change as fast. I mean, oh, there's a typo on the back of the box. Okay, when we print the next 10,000 wrappers, we'll fix that, or something in the formula of the product. Like you need to do R&D and do a long process to come up with the new version of this thing. Whereas on the internet, you're shipping code continuously all day long, and people are inventing new protocols and methods and little business tricks and things like that all the time. So the titles, the roles, the ways of structuring the work keep getting entangled or hopscotching or bringing back ideas in a new term. In some ways, product management is smuggling back in some of the same things that other lenses like design thinking or UX have brought, but mixed with a slightly different recipe. So I'm kind of talking in circles at this point, but I think it's a real phenomenon that you notice that it is different. And maybe that will stabilize over time. I mean, one thing I do like to point out to folks is that this is still very, very early days of the internet. You know, in normal human sense, this is stuff that none of us fully understand.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. No, great question.
It is certainly different when, you know, the cost of tooling up a factory to make a different size pack or
Exactly.
enormous investment takes, the tool changes are massive, but also, you know, they used to be dependent on this retail trade, the grocery trade or whoever.
Yeah, exactly.
You
There's
never
a
thought
distribution network.
your end customers. So you had this sort of double row, whereas, you know, now it's
Yeah,
very
with supply chain and you have marketing you've already planned on. So the pace was very different. It had to be.
it's
And
interesting.
they cut, I mean, it led to this, like there was like making it tighter and tighter and less tolerance for failure. But now we're like, it's that on steroids these days.
Yeah.
I'd like to say thank you to Christian. I really appreciate the presentation. I'm also someone who's been in the field for a long time, and just to what you just said, when I started my career as a software engineer, the QA cycle was approximately 3 years, and now it's approximately about 3 hours.
3 hours.
Yeah. If it happens at all.
Yeah.
Let the users test it live.
That's right. So your comment about understanding users, I still see to this day, teams, particularly in product management, they just want to skip over the user research. And I often try to articulate the risks in business terms if possible. And I think that sometimes helps them to understand and possibly reprioritize or shift. And I also just wanted to ask what people think. I just did a project on user research with transplant surgeons in technology that they use in OR. And I learned that without hesitation, if a surgeon is working on a very complex transplant issue, they'll call up a colleague and get advice right there. It doesn't matter that the other colleague works at a hospital in a different country or in a different, they'd have a freedom and fluidity and flexibility to consult on very, very difficult cases. And as a designer, you know, we don't have that flexibility, and I really think we should. Somebody mentioned earlier about the practice being perhaps closer to medicine. You know, as a practitioner, like a doctor, you practice medicine every day, and if you have a difficult case, you consult with your. So I'm just wondering if anybody else has had that feeling of frustration. Not being able to contact your colleagues and having to do everything in sort of a silo.
Maybe I can pitch in just my view on that to open the conversation. I think that depends on the culture of the organization rather than how much of a good network one has. I've been in places that type of conversation was no, but I also had extremely fruitful collaboration with other colleagues, designers, to solve problems. So I think it's a lot to do with the culture a little bit, and also how people are able to leave out their egos.
Mm-hmm.
That plays a huge role. And again, that goes to the notion of how the organization values and the reward system. If it is based on individual effort, then I'm going to be in competition. But if it is collective effort and the reward goes to the entire team, that changes the picture. I think there's a lot of dynamics and a multifaceted situation from my perspective. Related or not, I also want to some individual effort. I think there's an echo. But if it is collect, do you guys hear the echo?
No, not now.
Okay. What I was going to say is actually, Christian, you mentioned the lingo and how we articulate certain things. A good example is there's this whole concept of minimally viable product, right? And everybody's trying to meet that. But if we changed it to minimally viable experience, that changes the whole entire approach, right? So those type of things also play a role as how we should really look at the whole entire effort, product development and design. So just wanted to share that.
Yeah, I've also heard one of my mentors like to talk about a minimally valuable product as opposed to just being viable. And then lately I've come across something that tries to demystify it a little bit by just saying earliest testable. And you could say experience, earliest testable experience. Really, because it's not supposed to be a full product or whatever. It's that word product is misleading in there. You're really saying, what's the first thing we can put in front of people in some way and start learning something from this? But it gets presented to the bosses as V1, and then you're in this like weird MVP conversation forever. But no, that's a good point. And I think, Karen, you're I don't know, I'd say right now I'm doing this work with the Government Innovation Group. I work for the state of California, and what I keep coming around to over and over again, even though we're called digital innovation or data and innovation now, is that the most innovative thing we can usually do is just communicate better with the stakeholders and have timely meetings, that cut through the back and forth, to have stand-ups, to notice that somebody is feeling threatened by the thing and needs to be reassured. Human stuff, just understanding people's needs. And it's not as glamorous. Sometimes it's the digital part, but it's actually where most of the work happens, I think, at least at a certain level of coordination.
Absolutely. I had a follow-up question on because you've worked and experienced the two sides or the multiple sides of product management as well as user experience. I guess your experience in product management, how has it changed? And if so, your approach in design and UX, I guess.
I mean, how's it changed me or changed my approach in general? I mean, yeah, on the one hand, one story I tell myself is that I've just changed hats, I've changed titles, but in many ways, I've always been doing kind of the same thing. I've been coordinating, I've been clarifying, I've been communicating, I've been diplomatic, I've been trying to take leadership, in the sense of at least do the things that need to be done. And I've done it with all these different titles, and that's all true. And I think that's benefited me, say, versus maybe saying my identity is about information architecture, or my identity is about being a designer, or some other professional role or tribal identity or something like that, that may have limited my willingness to do a job that didn't have that title or wasn't framed in that way. But I would also say that when I became a product manager and even a product team leader with UX people and product managers reporting to me, I did very consciously take off my UX practitioner hat. I'm still going to claim to be somebody who gets UX, who can talk UX with my team and have a reasonable conversation with them. But the last thing I want to do is be kind of like that meme, like, oh, I'm something of a UX designer myself, like here, let me do it. I can still play. I haven't been a functioning UX designer, like delivering designs to people, for 10 years. I've been a product team lead. I've been a people manager. And, I was in a startup where I was actually doing the UX. So I'm kind of lying. I mean, I was actually doing some UX, but I wasn't doing it as well as anybody I could have hired. I was doing it because we couldn't afford anybody besides me. And I could do it okay because I've been around long enough. So it's changed in the sense that I think of myself as a person, as a customer of UX and a partner of UX. and even like a boss of UX people, but not a UX person anymore, directly. I still want to be a champion of it. I try to practice a form of product management that really gets the point of UX, and if anything, puts it very close to the center of everything. It's something also that I'm getting to do again at the state, where I'm on a service innovation team and I'm a product manager, but I'm sort of being able to model a form of product management that's not so domineering and is more about facilitating the UX side of things.
Gotcha. So I think for me, the takeaway was around, despite kind of being in both worlds, not that they're totally separate, but the egoless and the boundaryless approach to looking at things seems like that common aspect between whether you're a product manager or you're in design.
Yeah, and I can speak about myself more than I can try to generalize about everybody. So I want to be careful sometimes not to mistake my comfort zone or my temperament for a universal thing. But I would say that the kind of UX person I ever was and the kind of product person I am aren't that different. I was sort of always at the product end of the UX spectrum, let's say, or what turned out to be that. And so it felt, I spend less time in drawing packages and more time writing stuff and looking at data than I did when I was a designer. But that's okay, because I mean, like for me, for some people, being a designer is about putting the techno on the headphones and being really in the zone with, the drawing package or something like that, and that's a wonderful craft thing. But that was never really me, so I didn't have to give that up, to become a product manager or a head of product or something.
And I guess one area that we had written down earlier was any examples of real life situations, from the folks in the group. I know, Janet, you mentioned, wearing multiple hats and, seeing multiple sides of even design. I guess, how do you, open up the conversation when you have a conflict with any of your partners, knowing how maybe, or having the experience of doing that type of role or something similar. And you had a whole I think there was one slide around like the trust and maybe it was under the pain points, but turf and how do you kind of negotiate? How do you sort out things?
I mean, I'd definitely be interested if anybody here had any anecdotes to share.
I guess one could apply the same techniques as they are applying with their spouses. They would be a good starting point.
I was going to say something very similar. It's like trying to understand what the common goals are and like ensure that you are actually all working to that same objective. So if it's a marriage, it's like we want to be happy and support each other and enjoy things together and apart, whatever it is. And I honestly think business relationships shouldn't be so different, or team, stakeholder. In the end, if there is somebody who's really fighting against something, is it because they haven't fully embraced and understood the overall objective that you're all working to? There shouldn't really be conflict, just maybe not understanding the clarity of each other's skills you're bringing to the table, or the work that needs to be done, or who should take the lead on something. And it's usually a misunderstanding that it stems from. But it's an interesting question.
Yeah, that's why I encourage people to have the uncomfortable conversations. It's normal to want to avoid them. I don't want to have those conversations. I don't want to go into a room where I think someone's going to say no to me, or they don't agree with me, or they don't respect me the way, like it's true. They don't, that's a problem. But I need to know that if that's true. And so the thing is kind of gritting your teeth and kind of being brave about it. And one startup I worked at for a while, 7 Cups, we had a saying, the problem is the path, meaning that like, if you look the problem square in the eye, if you look at the real problem, the solution is in the problem. You find the solution by going deeply into the problem, and it's sort of like, oh, here's the splinter, here it is, and you take the splinter out. But if you avoid the problem, the splinter just festers there. You're just hoping it goes away on its own.
I love that splinter analogy. That's so great. Like you got to find it. What is it causing the pain? Yeah.
And it's more, and also be passionate with yourself that for not having done it yet. Like we all walk around with splinters that we hope will work their way out on their own, you know. But there's that point where you have to go, this thing is not fixing itself. I need to get the tweezers out. You know?
And often it's nothing to do with that splinter. It's the splinter next door to it that you can't, you know, they're in pain because other people aren't listening to them in their life or something. I mean,
No, it's also
complex.
it's also true that often you can't solve the problem on the one-on-one level because it is systemic. And sometimes it's like my organization is not set up to do this well. They're not teaching craft, they're not setting boundaries, they're not, and that's a tough thing to discover too, because then you're like, do I try to fix this place? Or am I hoping you know, to go somewhere, you know, that it's gonna you know, that I have to leave. You know, basically, like there's no way this place will ever get better. You escalate, you try to make things work, but sometimes you have to be realistic and go, I can't do my best work on this team because they don't value, or they don't, we can't come to a working agreement that's good enough for me. But I think that's a last resort, and a lot of people aren't even trying, you know, to work it out yet.
Yeah.
I will actually play time cop and point out that it's 9 o'clock, and I want to be mindful of everyone's time. And Christian, of course, thank you so much for taking the time. Any closing thoughts before we end our session today?
I think we've heard me enough, certainly. I see Gail just hopped on, an old friend from Bekai and Yahoo, so it's nice to see another friendly face out there.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for the discussion. We'll post some of these materials online and hope to see you next month.
Thanks, Meta. Thanks, Christian.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you all.
Bye.